Hi, welcome back. Third day of poetry, third and final, and then we'll move on to nonfiction for our last four readings before we finish up with the final paper. So I'll go through some business first, and then we'll talk about Philip Levine, Theodore Roethke, and Robert Hayden. As far as business stuff goes, let's see. You have a quiz waiting for you on Blackboard if you haven't taken it yet. I'm going to ask that you take it by Wednesday at 11 p.m., tomorrow at 11 p.m. That quiz should be very easy if you've done the reading. It's an open book quiz, and if you're not lazy, you should be able to ace this one. But do try to get it in by 11 p.m. on Wednesday. I won't take any quizzes after that. Also, you've got grades and comments on your paper from before, as well as your first round of blog, your tally there in my grades. We'll have another round of tallying the blogs, as well as a final paper due Wednesday, July 23rd, our last day of class, and that'll be at noon. I know a lot of the stuff's been due late, so I wanted to emphasize that is due at noon on that Wednesday. The reason is that I'm leaving the state on Thursday, so I'm going to need to be grading them right away. Okay, and keep up on the blogs. Don't forget, this week by Thursday night, I'm looking for 2 primary posts and 8 comments on others' blogs. And please do read the other people's blogs and comments before you post. That way we're not getting overlap here, and we get to maximize the effectiveness of those discussions. Okay, today, talk a little bit about poetry. First of all, one of the things we've seen by looking at old poetry is the difference between free verse and rhyme scheme. And when we think about poetry traditionally, we think about it having a very set rhyme scheme with exact repetition of sounds at the end of lines. And we see anything that doesn't have that, as we're getting used to newer, more modern verse, we see anything that doesn't have that kind of rhyme scheme as just free verse. One thing we got to remember, though, is that sometimes even within free verse, there is rhyme scheme. There is rhyme. It may not be last word of the line with exact sound match to the previous line or 2 lines previous, but it will still be using sound a lot. Poetry is very dependent on sound, and it will be using things like slant rhyme, where it's slightly off rhyme, or alliteration and consonants, so repetition of certain sounds within a line. So look for that. Try to notice that sound, and I think it will help to listen to a couple of the videos I posted, watch them, but mostly listen to them. I gave you both Hayden and Levine reading their poetry, and you can see where they intended there to be some rhyme or sound parallels. For example, one other thing to look for is what their meter is here, what the real sort of rhythm and bounce. Meter of a song, which syllables are pronounced more emphatically than others. You may not know this, but you know it because as you sing along to a song, you know which syllables to emphasize. And poetry is the same way. We don't have to necessarily read it the same way a writer does, but we do need to see that sound's a crucial component here, along with theme and imagery. Okay, also, there's 2 types of free verse, essentially, if you look at it that way, and this is keeping it fairly simple since it's a short poetry section, and that would be lyric poetry versus narrative poetry. Now, narrative poetry is story-based. It tells a story. Even if it's a fragment of a story, it should have some movement of characters in conflict, something like that, to create a narrative-based poem. The other type of poetry, which is perhaps more common, is lyric poetry, which does not rely on narrative or story, but which does use things like imagery and wordplay and sound to create something that is meaningful thematically without actually telling a story like a short story would. And that is not those aren't exact opposites. Some poems are, narrative poems with lyric elements and vice versa. But you can sort of divide the two into see what the poet is trying to do based on whether that poem is trying to tell a story. Another thing we'll see here, and from people like Roethke especially, but also Levine, is purposeful ambiguity. Meaning, when you read something like Rothke's poem, it's not that there is one reading that's right or another reading that's right, and it's one of the two, but actually the poet intended something to allow those 2 readings, to engender those 2 readings, to prompt maybe more than 2 readings within the reader. Again, like Eliot was doing in the High Modernists, we're now in the sort of probably considered the postmodern age, where still though the reader response is crucial, and it's not just a puzzle you're trying to figure out, but it may be purposefully ambiguous, purposefully multiple meanings. Okay, so let's look at Philip Levine, the former poet laureate of the United States. This is a much anthologized poem. I have included the video of him reading it, and it's called "What Work Is," and yet it's about more than just work. Work is the crucial word here, the purposeful ambiguity. What exactly is work? And he's going to have an answer for you of some kind, but we're going to deal with other types of work in this poem, such as standing in line, trying to get a job, and working the night shift of the Cadillac plant, and the other what we think of more commonly as work. But Levine will also look into family relationships and brotherly love and masculinity. How is it that men relate to each other, even brothers, when there is significant roadblocks to their expressing themselves in terms of emotions and communication? And I'd like to hear what you think he means work is here. That's that last line. So a couple of these poems have real humdinger last lines that are intended to sort of smack the reader in the face a little bit and make you think, what does this mean, and how does it apply, and how does it apply to my own life? So look for that. What is work for you, and what do you think the major theme is here? Is this a lyric or a narrative poem, and what's he trying to express, most of all? Okay, I'm going to go very briefly through these poems, just very quick introductions. Theodore Roethke, a Michigan, I think that's two Michigan residents, natives. Roethke was brought up by in a somewhat troubled home. His uncle died early, and his father died when he was 14, sort of depriving him of both male figures. He was a drinker, and drinking, in his family has been a major theme or device. It's always been there. When you're looking at Roethke, I think the important thing to ask is, what exactly is happening in this poem, My Papa's Waltz? I didn't find a good audio of him reading it, but I did look over his revisions for it. And it's very clear, if you look at the different drafts he wrote of this poem, that he, again, like Levine, wants to engender purposeful ambiguity here. He wants the reader to ask a question. What is this waltz? Is this waltz a fun... The dad is clearly a laborer who is home from work and is drinking and is engaged in some sort of physical interaction with his son. The two most obvious possibilities seem to be that it's a play dance. He's sort of waltzing him around the room drunkenly, maybe a little rougher than the mother had hoped for, but still a sort of loving or playful interaction. The other is that My Papa's Waltz is not at all loving or playful. That is, in fact, a story of abuse. That as the father is essentially beating his boy, the boy plays it into something like a waltz, ironically. It makes it all the more dark and disturbing to see the interaction as the mother's countenance could not unfrown itself, watching as the boy's right ear is scraped by the buckle, and as the father beats time on his head with a palm caked by dirt. He wrote that originally as kept time on his head and changed it to beat time. In other revisions, he changed it to sound less like abuse and more like play. So one big question you have to ask yourself is, what exactly is this? And remember, it may be the answer to, is this abuse or is this play? Maybe yes. It's abuse and it's play. It's more complicated than any of that. It's purposeful ambiguity, and it may have been some sort of interaction somewhere in between abuse and play. So look, I'd like to know how you read this poem, even beyond just that simple, is it abuse or is it play? Look into the careful wording he used here to try to create this purposeful ambiguity in order to create a more meaningful reading experience or listening experience for the audience. And that's what's really, how does this enhance theme to create this purposeful ambiguity? Okay, finally, we'll move on to Hayden. Robert Hayden is an even more troubled childhood. Grew up in Detroit. His house was, let's say, a house of disarray, and he was taken in as a foster child by his next door neighbors. His mother stayed in his life. His parents separated early, but so she was sort of a constant coming and going presence. In his own house, his foster house, Hayden faced also a lot of chronic angers, as he puts it, and he was afraid of what could happen, often afraid of the anger and the conflict in the house. He was a troubled kid because he had such terrible eyesight that he couldn't play any sports and couldn't really interact with his peers, so he was bullied and picked on, and it had debilitating depression for a time before he was able to emerge as a writer and professor. He was not only a foster child, not only a black poet, but also one of the only Baha'i faith poets. Probably the greatest poet of the Baha'i faith, not that I'm counting particularly. But he has a lot of different strands going into his tapestry, and he writes about them in much of his poetry. A lot of this poetry is confessional, or, as we saw with Plath, writing about oneself, one's own life, and the emotions and events of it. In this case, I think this one's got another humdinger last line. What do I know? What do I know of life's austere and lonely offices? Did I get that right? I've said it in my head so many times as I've grown up with this poem and thought about it, what it means. Look to this relationship with his, turns out to be foster father, though he doesn't clarify all of that, and probably to let it be more universal. As this is a poor family in a barely heated home in Detroit in winter, and the story of essentially a father who gets up, makes the house warm, prepares the family for the day, but may not be, let's say, a nurturing, loving father all of the time. With Roethke, he's sort of setting you up for that last line, that killer line, where he knows as a child he did not appreciate, or was not grateful for this person in his life and what he did. But as he grows up, he learns about life's austere, which means dry, spare, sort of free of gratitude or respect from outside sources. Love's austere and lonely offices, as in love is not always an easy place to be or an easy thing to do. I hope that you like these 3 examples of modern poetry, not necessarily modernists, that we're sort of into the postmodern era, but this is where poetry has come, a few examples of where poetry has come since our reading of Dickinson and the earlier poets of this section. I'd like to hear what you think of them, how they're using the various devices of their writing, the various formal elements, in order to enhance or create theme and really influence the reader in a way, give them something that they take away that matters to them. I'd like to see what you have to say on the blogs. I'll be checking in there later today. I'll have prompts up for your paper on Wednesday, and please send me an email or get in touch otherwise. I'd like to hear from you. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.